Welcome to Catalytic Leadership, the podcast designed to help leaders intentionally grow and thrive. Here is your host, author, and leadership and executive coach, Dr. William Attaway.
Hey, it's William, and welcome to today's episode of the Catalytic Leadership Podcast. Each week, we tackle a topic related to the field of leadership. My goal is to ensure that you have actionable steps you can take from each episode to grow in your own leadership. I believe, like Craig Rochelle has said many times, that when a leader gets better, everybody benefits. Your team, your department, your customers, your clients, your spouse, your kids, everybody. Each week, we spotlight leaders from a variety of fields, locations, and organizations. My goal is for you to see that leaders can be catalytic no matter where they are or what they lead. I draw inspiration from the stories and journeys of these leaders, and I hear from many of you that you do too. Let's jump in to today's interview. It is an honor today to have Jim Rafferty with us. Jim is the author of Leader by Accident: Lessons in Leadership, Loss, and Life. Leader by Accident recounts the tragedy that thrust Jim into a demanding volunteer role and how that experience fueled a subsequent journey into entrepreneurship. Jim's a marketing and communications consultant and principal of JM Marketing, LLC in Baltimore, Maryland. A former radio announcer and program director, Jim now puts 3 decades of marketing experience to work in helping businesses communicate more effectively with their audiences. Incurably married and the father of 2 grown children, Jim spends his spare time singing wherever people will listen and sharing cringeworthy dad jokes on social media. Man, Jim, I can't wait for this conversation because I'm a big fan of dad jokes, so I'm expecting at least a handful during this talk.
Oh, we'll get there. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Jim, I would love for you to share some of your story with our listeners, particularly around your journey and your development as a leader. How did you get started?
Sure. Leader by Accident starts in 2008 when I very suddenly became scoutmaster of our son's Boy Scout troop when the scoutmaster and his wife and their 2 younger kids were all shot to death by their 15-year-old son.
Oh,
and
my goodness.
That is, every bit as horrible as it sounds and worse. And, the scoutmaster part, may not sound like a big deal, but, this is obviously a critical moment for the troop. We really didn't know if the organization would survive. And at this moment, they turned to a guy, me, who had been a Boy Scout for all of about 2 weeks as a kid. I really didn't like it. I didn't have any outdoor skills to speak of in terms of camping, hiking, the things you want your scoutmaster to know about. And I didn't have a position in the troop up to that point. So for me, this was a very unusual, thing that they had asked me to step into this role. And with the help of a lot of other people and support, things went pretty well. And I remained scoutmaster for 5 years. And those were, sort of life-changing for me in a couple of ways. One, in the sense of, stepping into this leadership role and helping to shepherd the organization through a really, really difficult stretch. But, the other part of it, I think, was the quite literally getting out of my comfort zone with some of the camping and hiking adventures that we did, backpacking trips to Yellowstone National Park for several days, and another trip, actually not a scouting trip. My wife and I and another couple hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and against all odds, hike back out 5 days later, a trip to the Florida Keys with the scouts and all these things. And all that in itself is a nice enough story and certainly has a leadership component to it. But I think where the rubber really meets the road in terms of the book is the way that prepared me for a few years later when I got shown the door at the job I'd held for almost 21 years at that point. And it had never crossed my mind to that point to do anything other than have a job and have somebody hand me a paycheck and be responsible for my benefits and all that stuff. And what happened instead was that I wound up hanging out my shingle as a marketing consultant and sort of stepping off the ledge and out of my comfort zone again into entrepreneurship. And that was 10 years ago, and it's been easily, hands down, the most successful, enjoyable, however you want to describe it, stretch of my professional life. And awesome. I have no doubt that the first step out of the comfort zone into that scoutmaster role, and the experiences that led to really made the second step out of my comfort zone into entrepreneurship possible. So those two stories together really are the basis of Leader by Accident.
No, that's fascinating, because I don't think you anticipated, from what you said, either of those, or could have anticipated either one of those.
No, they were obviously, the tragedy was sudden and unexpected. You never know that anything like that is coming. And, with the job, I guess in hindsight, the writing was on the wall. The company had changed hands about a year before, but I did not see eye to eye with the new ownership. And, I should have been better prepared for that, but in hindsight, I wasn't. But, it all turned out okay. And I'm a firm believer that things happen for a reason, and that things turn out for the best. And in both these cases, they did.
Now, that's so indicative of so many stories, that it's the unexpected that makes such a huge impact in your journey, particularly around your leadership journey. In all of these different contexts, you've experienced leadership in different ways, in a volunteer organization, in business environment, now running your own, right? How would you define leadership?
Wow, there are so many definitions of leadership. They're all good. One of my favorite quotes about it is Eisenhower, and I won't get it word for word, but it's basically, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because they want to do it. Something to that effect. But, the more I write about and speak about and have conversations like this around leadership, I think it's changed a little bit, or maybe had the focus shifted a little bit over these past few years with the pandemic and the Great Resignation and all that, and has called for much greater levels of empathy. And, ultimately what I come back to is, if you want to be a better leader, be a better person. Leadership is not something you do when you walk through the office doors and something you turn off when you leave. It's about caring about the people around you all the time. And, we are what we repeatedly do. And I think that, that for me is the key to being a good leader. And we could talk about any number of different components of that, but that's what it boils down to for me.
That's good. So moving into a scoutmaster role, right, with no background really in this on a personal level, and this not really being your sweet spot, of just loving the outdoors and camping, and I'm with you there. I mean, I like to live indoors. That's my favorite thing. So,
Sure.
Like, this was out of your comfort zone.
It was a lot, and a couple things happened, and I think that in hindsight, the way that I approached it is maybe a good lesson for leaders thrown into any situation. But the first thing that happened was a few people who were far more qualified than I was offered to step up and serve as assistant scoutmasters. And, they were people who just didn't have the bandwidth at that moment to take on the scoutmaster job. So I had a really good team around me to handle the nuts and bolts of the scouting program. And the other thing that happened was, beyond those three guys, and we were still friends, we were a wonderful team together. Beyond those three guys, I was very honest with both the scouts and their parents about my own lack of experience. I did not try to hide from it. And among the very first things I did was an all hands email to the parents. And I said, look, if this is going to work, we need your help. More of you need to step up and do more things and take on more responsibilities. And you know what? They did. And that was a really good lesson to, not be afraid to admit that you don't know what you don't know, and B, not be afraid to ask for help, because, a year later, the troop was thriving. We were a little bigger in numbers. We had all the parents involved. Everything was, we had one Saturday, I talk about it a little bit in the book, where we did 3 different events as a troop. We had parents, doing in the kitchen cooking pancakes for a fundraiser to raise money for a trip that their kids weren't going on, that kind of thing. It was really a wonderful time and a wonderful example of everybody pitching in and helping.
And I love the authenticity that you showed there, and the transparency, because that's something that so often leaders don't do. They pretend like they know all the answers, they've got it all together, and, don't let them see you sweat. That old model of leadership that really never worked, if we're honest, but it kept getting passed down from generation to generation. And what you led with authenticity and with transparency. And I think on this side, particularly, like you said, on this side of the pandemic with the Great Resignation and things that people are struggling with, that's what people lean into. They see a leader that's authentic and transparent. They lean toward that person.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time we get being a leader confused with being the boss. And they certainly cross over, but they're not the same thing. And we would see this play out with the scouts over and over again, where, a young man would get elected patrol leader. So now he's, in charge of 6 or 7 other kids. And he would interpret that to mean, I'm going to sit here and order you guys around and you're going to do what I say. And of course, they would cheerfully ignore him, and he'd come back to us in tears, and, and he'd have his first good lesson about leadership. But, beyond the scouts, I mean, I can think back. I moved to Baltimore from my hometown of Philadelphia when I was 28 years old to be program director of a radio station, and probably a total of about 10 people full-time and part-time reporting to me. And I think every one of them was older, and in some cases by, a couple of decades. And that was a situation where I was not, authentic and honest about my lack of experience at all. And I tried to be the boss, and it didn't go so well. So, part of these things, I think we learn with age and experience, but I'm a big believer in being as honest and transparent as possible with people over where you are as a leader.
It's a good word. Some listeners may be thinking, okay, so taking over a volunteer position, I mean, that really doesn't sound like that big of a deal. But this was really important in your life. What made it that way? Why should people lean toward this story?
It is. When I tell the story, I say, so, the Scoutmaster doesn't exactly, carry the nuclear football. It may not seem like that big a deal, but, it's a pretty demanding volunteer job in the best of times. And this was anything but the best of times. I mean, the troop at that point was about 25 young men, and suddenly reduced by 3, plus their very much beloved Scoutmaster. And none of us had ever lived through anything like this. Just the shock and the grief and all of that. And so, the question as a group was, would the troop survive? Would the other parents just not want their young men around those memories? And who could blame them, right?
Yeah.
And I think part 2 of what sort of made everything work, maybe part 3. So other people stepped up and helped. I was transparent with parents and scouts about my own lack of experience. But, the third piece of that, I guess, is that as a group, we did not hide from what happened. We made it a regular practice in our meetings as, the case wound its way through the courts, as there was news, to talk about it, and to check in on each other and to be there for each other and see how everybody was doing, So we circled up and handled it as a group. And I think that's a large part of what got us through it.
Yeah, in the book, you talk about a series of talks that you had communicating with the troop, and then you translate those lessons for adult leaders. What do you think made those communications effective?
Yeah, you're talking about the Scoutmaster Minute, and that's a part of the Scoutmaster the scouting program. Not every troop does it, but when I took over as Scoutmaster, I thought, well, I don't know 5 ways to light a fire without matches or all these other things. But the Scoutmaster Minute, the delivering a brief homily to a captive audience at the end of each meeting, that's something I could probably do. So I worked pretty hard on those and gave them a lot of thought. And then as I went, I never wrote them down beforehand, but the next day, the day after the meeting, I would sort of type up approximately what I had said just to keep an archive. And then, as you note, I kept that archive and then used those throughout the book. And you put it exactly right. I try to take the lesson, whatever it was that we were trying to impart to the scouts, and then translate it into something meaningful for you and me, and people trying to be better leaders and better human beings. And it was very gratifying to me that over those 5 years, a number of our scouts, upon reaching their Eagle Scout rank, and we had quite a few, they would, at the ceremony, reminisce about their scouting careers and tell stories and that kind of thing. And a number of them mentioned those Scoutmaster Minutes as a source of inspiration. And that was very meaningful to me because, the scouting program in general, I think is so important, because that is a stretch of life. The scouts are 11 to 17 years old, when they need more positive voices in their ear. And, because there's so much other stuff competing with it, especially these days with, everything that's online. So to be one of those positive voices and to feel like you were getting through and making an impact was very meaningful.
There's so much advice out there about getting out of your comfort zone, which is what you had to do. What do you think is missing from all of that advice?
I think what's missing from that advice is that you don't have to live outside your comfort zone, right? This book is about 2 huge trips out of my comfort zone. And honestly, writing a book and putting this, fairly personal little memoir out there and having conversations like this, or, take me out of my comfort zone again. But, having said all that, I'm the biggest homebody creature of routine you will ever find. I mean, it's not like I'm out, paragliding and bungee jumping every day. I just, but we have to challenge ourselves from time to time. I love the quote and, from the wise old preacher, supposedly, who said, God loves you just the way you are.
Yeah.
And he loves you too much to let you stay that way.
Yeah.
If we're not challenging ourselves and doing the things that make us uncomfortable, then we're treading water and not going anywhere. And that's not good.
You've got a section in the book that is a somewhat different angle looking at organizational culture. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
It grows out of a couple of stories I tell in the book, but basically situations where just a few words spoken either from me to, I'll tell one real quickly. I was setting up chairs before a meeting with one of our scouts who was then a junior in high school. And I knew that. So just chit chat, small talk. I asked him what he was thinking about as far as college majors. And we talked a little bit about that. And I forgot the conversation had happened because it was just that. It was, small talk. About a year and a half later, when he reached the rank of Eagle Scout, he sent me a very nice handwritten note thanking me. And in that note, he referenced that conversation and said that was the first time in his life that anybody had ever asked him what he wanted to do with his life. Now that's 15 or 16 years old at that point. And that was so eye-opening to me that what I thought was, a throwaway question, right? 6 words. What do you like to do is what I asked him. Had a much deeper impact than I intended. Now, in this case, that was a good thing, but it's just as easy, in leadership roles for that to be not a good thing, where what you think is a joke, a throwaway comment, whatever, might be taken the wrong way. And I think there's a special danger of that these days as we have all these ways to communicate, and most of them involve typing and not talking. So, if I'm managing a team and I'm communicating something halfway important via email or Slack or text or something, I sure want to be in the habit of following up in person to make sure not only that it was received and understood, but that it was interpreted the way that I intended. Because otherwise you wind up with somebody with their nose out of joint and you're going to be the last one to know about it. And neither of those are good things. So yes, it's a little bit of a different take on leadership in the book, in the sense of, really reconsidering the language that we use and the way we use it around people, because it's easy, especially when they're looking to us for leadership, when we're in that, the scoutmaster position, the boss position, whatever it is, for it to be interpreted in ways we didn't intend.
I've heard Andy Stanley say more than once that as leaders, our words weigh 10,000 pounds. We don't,
Truth. That's really well put.
We're not aware of that often.
Yeah.
But when we speak and we even in a light conversation, like what you're describing, those are heavy words.
Right. And it sounds like not a big thing. And in the book I reference, there's a Tom Peters quote in there from one of his books that says, and I won't get it word for word, but basically says, organizational culture is shaped by the way the boss greets the receptionist as she walks in the door, by the casual comments the boss makes to the 3 or 4 people she passes on the way to her office, by the tone of the emails she sends responding to stuff in the first 15 minutes of the day. And it's all that, we spend so much time and money and effort chasing this, organizational culture, employee engagement and all that, but we maybe not enough time considering the words we use and the smaller things like that, because they're big contributors to culture.
Do you have any advice that you would give to new leaders or entrepreneurs or somebody who's in an unexpected leadership role?
Yes, and maybe slightly different for new leaders and entrepreneurs. The new leaders, I think we already talked about, is don't be afraid to, really for both, don't be afraid to ask for help. You don't need to go it alone. And I am the guy who will walk around the store for 45 minutes before I ask somebody where to find something, right? So it goes very much against my nature to ask for help. Ask my wife. But you need to. And my one regret from the years that I spent employed was not spending enough time just reaching out and developing more of a network. Not with any, and I think we get this head trash around that kind of thing where if we are going to reach out to somebody and say, hey, how about we meet and have coffee and talk, that it's got to be a transactional thing, that somebody's got to benefit from it or some business has to be done. And it doesn't. It's simply let's get to know each other. And, it's the same head trash we have around networking events, which comes up so often in the business peer group meetings that I run and participate in, where people hate networking events because they feel this pressure. Like, if I don't get 3 good leads, why am I here? And it's really not, because it's just getting to know people, and the getting to know people will lead to other things. If that person isn't a good prospect for you or vice versa, that maybe they know somebody who is. And if not, you've made another friend. And those connections play out like a spider web. So I wish I'd really fully understood that, 10 years plus ago, before, I had to start doing that stuff as an entrepreneur. So new entrepreneur, reach out, have coffee with people, whether you think they can help you or not, and especially if they can. And people are so willing to offer their advice and their help. I mean, I had a guy who was really no more of than an acquaintance really at that point. And when I was starting my own thing, and I reached out to him and we sat down, and he runs an ad agency. So, technically we would compete a little bit, I guess, but he gave me the name of his banker and another professional, and he gave me copies of his agreements that I used with clients to modify and use as my own, and was so generous. And people are out there. Entrepreneurs really want to see other entrepreneurs succeed. And they are there to help in the vast majority of cases. I've run across a couple of exceptions, but they are the exceptions and not the rule.
I hope that everybody listening is listening hard to what you just said, Jim, because I think that generosity of spirit and leaning into networking connections long before you ever need them, not thinking about what's in it for me, but simply making a new connection and having open hands, that is gold. And like you, I wish that's something I had learned 15, 20 years ago, because I think that would have put me in a different place today.
And when that does come up in these peer group meetings, my advice to people is always, because, they're like, oh, I hate those things. I'm terrible at small talk. And I'm like, make it not about you. Make it about the other person. What can you do to help them? It'll all come back. It won't come back that night. You're not going to walk away with 3 new clients, but you'll walk away with 3 people who think much more highly of you than they did before. If you're trying to help them, and it all comes back. It absolutely does.
Every leader that I talk to is a continual learner, and you are most assuredly in that group. Is there a book that has made a significant impact on your life that you would recommend that leaders read?
I guess there's a couple of approaches to that. One is to look at other leaders, and I think guys like me are big fans of history. And I just finished one about Churchill called The Splendid and the Vile, VILE, by Eric Larson. And it's basically the whole year plus of the Blitz in England, as told mostly through the diaries of the people who were around Churchill. And it's almost day by day, but you really get a sense of what a remarkable guy he was in leading the country through that. And obviously anything about Abraham Lincoln, I'm, also a huge fan of that. And, sort of similar circumstances where, there was an existential threat to their nation at that point, and they were the ones to lead through it. And it's a bumpy road in both cases, but they got it done. So, I lean towards that kind of thing. I do certainly read the business self-help books. I think, the Tom Peters In Search of Excellence was great. I think the E-Myth Revisited, about scaling, how you have to put the systems in place before you can scale a business and grow, that kind of thing. But I read constantly, and some fiction too, but sure.
Definitely. I know our listeners are going to want to stay connected with you and continue learning from you, Jim. What is the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can learn more about the book, about me, about all that at leaderbyaccident.com. Probably in terms of social media, there's a Leader by Accident page on Facebook, and they can certainly connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'm Jim Rafferty, and you'll see my smiling face there.
Brilliant. I'll make sure to have all those links in the show notes so folks can
Thank you so
easily
much.
Connect with you there. Jim, this has been a joy. So I'm gonna open it up for you now to close us out with a dad joke.
So this one was around Thanksgiving, where I said to the grocery store clerk, "Excuse me, did these turkeys get any bigger?" And he said, "No, sir, they're all dead."
Hey-o!
There we go. Thank you.
Well done.
Thanks.
Jim, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining me for this episode today. As we wrap up, I have a couple of requests for you. I'd love for you to do two things. First, subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. And if you find value here, I'd love it if you would rate it and review it. That really does make a difference in helping other people to find this podcast. Second, if you don't have a copy of my newest book, Catalytic Leadership, I'd love to put a copy in your hands. If you go to catalyticleadershipbook.com, you can get a copy for free. Just pay the shipping so I can get it to you, and we'll get one right out. My goal is to put this into the hands of as many leaders as possible. This book captures principles that I've learned in 20 plus years of coaching leaders in the entrepreneurial space, in business, government, nonprofits, education, and the local church. You can always connect with me on LinkedIn to keep up with what I'm learning and thinking about. And if you're ready to take a next step with a coach who can help you to intentionally grow and thrive as a leader, I'd be honored to help you. Just go to catalyticleadership.net to book a call with me. And stay tuned for our next episode next week. Until then, as always, leaders, choose to be catalytic.
Thanks for listening to Catalytic Leadership with Dr. William Attaway. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss the next episode. Want more? Go to catalyticleadership.net.